What if a single careless joke sealed your fate in the blistering heat of the Arizona Territory, a place where a woman's future is bartered like cattle? Catherine Hayes made a bold, foolish declaration. Staring at a devil of a horse, a beast no man could break, she laughed and announced she'd marry whoever could tame it. It was a joke meant to silence the endless parade of suitors. But she never counted on him. A silent, nameless Apache warrior, a man who was less than a ghost to her society, stepping from the shadows. She never imagined he could do it with nothing more than a single whisper. The dust of Prescott, Arizona in 1883 was a fine red powder that settled on everything, on the stiff lace of a lady's collar, the brim of a rancher's hat, and the conscience of a man like Judge Lawrence Hayes. The judge valued three things above all else: the law, his reputation, and his daughter Catherine, likely in that order. It was for the sake of the latter too that he'd purchased the horse. It wasn't just a horse, it was a legend in the making, a midnight black stallion with fire in its eyes, and a lineage as wild as the Bradshaw Mountains from which it was captured. They called him Diablo, and the name fit. He had crippled 2 ranch hands, and sent a third, a so-called expert, from Tucson over the fence with a shattered collarbone. For Judge Hayes, Diablo was a tool. His daughter Catherine was fast approaching 21. She possessed a sharp mind, a sharper tongue, and a spirit as untamed as the stallion. She had dismissed every suitable and wealthy bachelor from Prescott to Phoenix. The judge figured if a man could conquer the beast, he'd surely have the mettle to handle his daughter. It was a crude, frontier style of matchmaking, but it was all he could conjure. "He is magnificent, isn't he?" Thomas Sterling said, his voice smooth as polished leather. He stood beside Catherine at the corral fence, the afternoon sun glinting off his perfectly coiffed blonde hair. Sterling was the son of a railroad magnate, the most persistent, and in her father's eyes, the most promising of her suitors. Catherine watched Diablo pace the enclosure, muscles rippling like dark water. His intelligence was palpable. He wasn't just fighting, he was thinking, anticipating. "He's a prisoner, Thomas, and he hates it. Everything of value must eventually be owned, Catherine. Land, gold, even beauty." He let his gaze linger on her, a look of proprietary confidence that made her skin crawl. "My father agrees. He said a man who can break that horse can build an empire." A crowd had gathered. It was Saturday, and the spectacle of another man attempting to ride Diablo was better than any saloon show. The judge stood on the porch of his stately home, arms crossed, watching the proceedings like a king surveying his court. Today was Thomas Sterling's turn. He had the finest saddle, the sharpest spurs, and the most arrogant smile Catherine had ever seen. She hated this, hated being the prize in this masculine contest. Her father's unsubtle message was clear. She, like the horse, was a wild thing, in need of taming and ownership. Sterling entered the corral. He moved with a practiced swagger, the confidence of a man who had never known failure. Diablo stopped pacing. The horse's head went low, its ears flattened, and a low guttural snort rumbled from its chest. The air crackled with a tension so thick it was almost visible. The contest was brutally short. Sterling managed to get the saddle on, but the moment he threw a leg over, Diablo erupted. It wasn't just bucking. It was a cyclone of fury, a coordinated explosion of hooves and teeth. Sterling was airborne in seconds, landing in an undignified heap against the far fence. The crowd roared, a mix of laughter and disappointed groans. Sterling, his face the color of a thundercloud, limped out of the corral, brushing the red dust from his expensive trousers. Jebediah Smith, a grizzled old rancher with a face like a dried-up riverbed, spat a stream of tobacco juice. "That horse ain't meant for a saddle, Judge. He's pure spirit. Some things ain't meant to be broken." It was then that the frustration the humiliation and the sheer rebellious anger in Catherine's soul boiled over. She stepped forward, her voice ringing out with a clarity that cut through the murmuring crowd. "That's because you're all using force," she declared, her eyes flashing. She didn't know where the words came from, only that they felt true. She was sick of being managed, of being courted with displays of wealth and power. She wanted something more, something genuine, even if she couldn't name it. Her father shot her a warning look. Thomas Sterling's face was a mask of wounded pride. Feeling reckless, empowered by the crowd's sudden silence, Catherine doubled down. She laughed a bright, slightly hysterical sound and made the joke that would shatter her world. "You know what?" she called out, gesturing grandly towards the heaving, triumphant stallion. "Forget fortunes and last names. I'll marry whoever tames this horse. I'll marry any man who can show a little understanding instead of just brute force." The crowd chuckled. It was a fine joke from the judge's fiery daughter. A woman's silly, romantic notion. Thomas Sterling sneered openly. Judge Hayes's face hardened, his jaw tight with fury at the public spectacle. The words hung in the air, audacious and impossible. Catherine felt a thrill of victory. She had made her point. She had rendered their ridiculous contest absurd. And then a shadow detached itself from the wall of the nearby livery stable. He moved with a silence that was unnatural in the dusty, noisy street. He was Apache. It was clear in the high set of his cheekbones, the straight line of his black hair, unbound and falling past his shoulders, and the buckskin clothes that seemed a part of the landscape itself. He was nameless to them, faceless, one of the people who lived at the edge of their world, seen but never acknowledged. He was lean, but there was a coiled strength in his stillness, a profound patience in his dark, unreadable eyes. He stopped at the corral gate, his gaze not on Catherine or the stunned crowd, but solely on the horse. Diablo, still agitated, snorted and pawed the ground, but his wild eyes were also fixed on the newcomer. A nervous whisper went through the crowd. What was he doing here? The man opened the gate and slipped inside, closing it gently behind him. He held no rope, no whip, no saddle. His hands were empty. He was a ghost walking into a storm, and everyone held their breath. The silence that fell over the crowd was absolute, a heavy blanket smothering the usual Saturday afternoon din. All eyes were on the two figures in the corral, the untamable black stallion and the silent Apache man who dared to enter his domain. Catherine felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Her joke, so bold and freeing a moment ago, now felt like a lead weight. The man whom the townsfolk would later learn was called Nakai didn't approach Diablo directly. Instead, he walked a slow, deliberate circle around the edge of the corral, his movements fluid and unthreatening. He kept his eyes averted, his posture relaxed, conveying a message of peace, not challenge. This was a stark contrast to Thomas Sterling's aggressive swagger. Diablo watched him, every muscle tensed. The horse's ears swiveled, tracking the man's silent progress. The furious, panicked energy began to subside, replaced by a watchful curiosity. The stallion snorted, a plume of dust rising from the ground, but he held his position. "What in God's name does he think he's doing?" Judge Hayes muttered under his breath, his face a mixture of anger and disbelief. "This is a farce." "He'll be killed," Sterling added, with a grim satisfaction. "It will serve the girl right for her outburst." Catherine ignored them both, her gaze riveted to the scene. She found herself holding her breath, her hands gripping the top rail of the fence so tightly her knuckles were white. She had never seen anything like it. The man was speaking a language without words, a language of pure intention. After completing his circle, Nakai stopped. He was still a good 20 feet from the horse. Slowly he sank into a crouch, making himself smaller, less of a threat. He remained perfectly still for what felt like an eternity. The sun beat down, casting long shadows across the corral. Finally, Diablo took a hesitant step forward. Then another. He lowered his massive head, his nostrils flaring as he scented the air. He was no longer a devil. He was an animal, cautious and intelligent, trying to understand the strange, calm creature that had entered his space. Nakai didn't move a muscle. He simply waited. The horse drew closer and closer, until its whiskered nose was only a few feet from the man's knee. The crowd gasped collectively. Jebediah Smith, the old rancher, slowly removed his hat, as if in the presence of something sacred. Then the man began to speak. His voice was too low for anyone at the fence to hear the words. It was a soft, rhythmic murmur, more like the sound of a gentle stream than a human voice. A whisper. It flowed into the dusty air, a current of sound that seemed to mesmerize the stallion. Catherine leaned forward, straining to hear, but it was impossible. She could only watch the effect. Diablo's entire body seemed to soften. The tension drained from his powerful shoulders, his head lowered further, and his ears, which had been rigid with alarm, flickered and relaxed. He nudged Nakai's shoulder with his nose. Slowly, gracefully, Nakai rose to his feet. He never broke the stream of his quiet words. He lifted a hand not quickly, but with a deliberate slowness that allowed the horse to see his every intention. He laid his palm flat on the stallion's powerful neck. Diablo didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned into the touch, letting out a long, shuddering sigh. Nakai stroked the horse's neck, his murmurs continuing. He walked alongside him, his hand never leaving his coat. He then did something that made Catherine's heart leap into her throat. He leaned his weight against the horse's side, and with an effortless, fluid motion, he swung himself onto Diablo's bare back. There was no bucking, no explosion of rage. The horse stood as placidly as a seasoned cow pony, his ears twitching as he listened to the man on his back. Nakai gently took hold of the horse's mane, leaned forward, and whispered something directly into his ear. Then, with a slight pressure of his knees, he urged the horse forward. Diablo walked. He walked a calm, steady lap around the corral, his steps sure and easy. He was no longer Diablo the Devil. He was just a horse, and he had found a partner, not a master. The silence from the crowd broke into a wave of astonished murmurs and exclamations. No one could believe what they had just witnessed. It was like watching a miracle or a magic trick. Nakai guided the horse back to the center of the corral and slid off its back as easily as he had gotten on. He gave the stallion one last pat on the neck before turning to face the stunned audience. His dark eyes swept over the shocked faces until they landed on Catherine. He did not smile. He did not boast. His expression was one of quiet solemnity. He had held up his end of the bargain. The reality of her words came crashing down on Catherine with the force of a physical blow. "I'll marry whoever tames this horse." Her own voice echoed in her mind, a mocking, triumphant ghost. It had been a joke, a flippant, angry jest meant to put men like Thomas Sterling in their place. It was never meant to be taken seriously. And it was certainly never meant to be answered by a nameless Apache who had just achieved the impossible. Judge Lawrence Hayes looked from the tamed horse to the Apache, then to his daughter. His face was pale, his lips a thin white line. In his world, a man's and a woman's word was their bond. To go back on it publicly would be the ultimate disgrace, a stain on the Hayes name that would never wash out. Thomas Sterling stepped forward, his face contorted in a sneer of disbelief and rage. "This is a trick, some kind of savage witchcraft. It doesn't count." "The girl was joking, Judge. Tell them." But the judge's eyes were locked with Nakai's. In the silent warrior's gaze, he saw no trickery, only a calm, unyielding expectation. He had answered the challenge laid before him. Catherine felt a wave of dizziness. The faces of the townsfolk swam before her eyes. Some looked amused, some shocked, some contemptuous. They were all waiting to see what the judge's daughter would do. They were waiting to see if the high and mighty Catherine Hayes was a woman of her word, or just a foolish girl who spoke before she thought. Her life as she knew it was over. It had ended not with a bang, but with a whisper in the dust. The aftermath was a suffocating silence, followed by a storm. Inside the judge's house, the heavy velvet curtains were drawn against the prying eyes of the town, but they could not shut out the disgrace. "You will not go through with this, Judge." Hayes stated his voice, dangerously low. He paced the length of his study, his hands clasped behind his back. The room with its leather-bound books and mahogany desk had always been a symbol of order and authority. Now it felt like a cage. "It was what I said." Father Catherine replied, her own voice, barely a whisper. She stood by the window, her body rigid. She felt strangely detached, as if she were watching a play about someone else's ruined life. It was a jest, a moment of female hysterics. He thundered, spinning to face her. No one in their right mind would hold you to it. Sterling is right, it was some kind of Indian trick. Was it Catherine shot back a spark of her old fire returning? Or was it that he showed the animal respect instead of trying to beat it into submission? What he did was more masterful than anything Thomas Sterling could do in 100 years. The words were out, before she could stop them, a defense of the nameless man she didn't even know she possessed. "Respect," the judge laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "He is a savage from the reservation, Catherine. He has no name, no property, no standing. He is for all intents and purposes not even a citizen under the law. Marrying him is not just social suicide. It is madness. It would make you an outcast. It would make me a laughingstock." The weight of his words pressed down on her. He was right. In their world, she would become a pariah. The women who had once been her friends would cross the street to avoid her. She would be the town scandal, the girl who threw herself away on an Indian. And yet, a stubborn kernel of pride refused to be crushed. Her father and Thomas Sterling represented a world of control of ownership, where she was just another asset to be managed. Her foolish, reckless words had been a rebellion against that. To back down now, to let her father smooth it over and pretend it never happened, felt like a deeper kind of defeat. It would mean admitting that her words, her promises, were meaningless. "My word is my word," she said, her chin lifting. "It is a lesson you yourself taught me." The judge stared at her, his face a battleground of fury and a dawning, horrified respect. He was trapped by his own code of honor, hoisted on the petard of the very principles he'd instilled in his daughter. For the Hayes family, public integrity was everything. A public declaration, even one made in jest, was a debt that had to be paid. The town of Prescott didn't wait to pass judgment. The story of the taming of Diablo and the judge's daughter's shocking promise spread like wildfire. Thomas Sterling, his ego shattered, became the story's most venomous narrator, painting Catherine as a wanton fool and the Apache as a dark sorcerer. The man himself had simply melted back into the shadows after the event, but 2 days later he returned. He did not come to the front door. He simply appeared at the back of the property near the stables as the sun was setting. A servant announced his presence in a hushed, scandalized tone. Judge Hayes met him outside. Catherine watched from the kitchen window, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The two men stood several feet apart, a chasm of culture and prejudice separating them. The judge stiff and formal in his dark suit, the Apache whom they now knew as Nakai, still and watchful in his buckskins. The conversation was short. The judge's posture was rigid with defeat. He returned to the house, his face ashen. "He will take you," he said to Catherine without looking at her. "He has a small piece of land, granted by treaty, a few miles up near the San Pedro River. He says he will build a proper shelter. The wedding will be in 3 days." The word wedding sounded obscene. There would be no white dress, no flowers, no well-wishers. The circuit judge, a man named Arthur Peel, who owed Judge Hayes a significant favor, would perform the service. It would be a quiet, legal transaction designed to fulfill the letter of the promise and contain the scandal as much as possible. The next 3 days were a blur of misery for Catherine. Her friend stopped calling. The household staff spoke to her in whispers, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. She packed a single trunk, her hands moving mechanically. What does one pack for a life she cannot possibly imagine? She packed sturdy dresses, her riding boots, a few cherished books and a small pearl-handled derringer her mother had given her, tucking it deep into the folds of a woolen shawl. The wedding took place in Judge Hayes's study. It was a grim, hollow affair. Judge Peel looked deeply uncomfortable, rushing through the words as if they burned his tongue. Catherine wore a simple grey dress. She felt cold, numb. Nakai stood beside her, silent as stone. He wore a clean but simple tunic and leggings. He smelled of sage and wood smoke, a scent as alien as the man himself. When Judge Peel asked, "Do you, Catherine Hayes, take this man?" he faltered, unsure what name to use. Nakai's voice, when it came, was low and clear. "Nakai. Take Nakai to be your lawfully wedded husband." Catherine's voice was a choked whisper. "I do." She could not bring herself to look at him. She stared at a spot on the wall, focusing on the intricate patterns of the wallpaper, trying to dissociate from the surreal nightmare her life had become. They were pronounced man and wife. There was no kiss, no celebration, only the scratch of Judge Peel's pen on the certificate sealing her fate. Outside, a single horse was waiting Diablo. He was saddled not with an expensive leather creation like Sterling's, but with a simple, functional blanket saddle. He stood patiently nuzzling Nakai's shoulder when he approached. Another horse, a sturdy mare, was tethered nearby for her. Her father approached her as she stood by the mare. "You made this choice, Catherine," he said, his voice strained. He pressed a small, heavy pouch into her hand. "This is all I can do for you now. Do not expect to be welcomed back here." The rejection was a physical pain sharper than anything she had ever felt. Tears stung her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give him or anyone the satisfaction. She mounted the mare without a word. Nakai was already on Diablo's back, waiting. He looked at her, once his dark eyes inscrutable, then turned his horse and started down the road, away from the town, away from the life she had known. Catherine took one last look at the grand house she had grown up in, then followed her husband into an unknown future, a prisoner of her own reckless words. The journey to Nakai's land was a silent one. He rode ahead, a lean figure, perfectly balanced on Diablo's back, moving with the horse, as if they were one being. Catherine followed the dust from their passage, coating her dress and filling her lungs. The sun beat down relentlessly, and the landscape grew wilder, the neat fences and properties of Prescott giving way to open rangeland, dotted with mesquite saguaro and jagged rock formations. They rode for hours. The silence was a living thing, stretching between them thick with unspoken questions and resentments. Catherine's mind raced. What was she supposed to do? What was she supposed to say? This man, her husband, was a complete stranger, a man from a world she couldn't comprehend. She was terrified, but a stubborn part of her refused to show it. She kept her back straighter and her gaze fixed on the horizon, mimicking a confidence she did not feel. They finally arrived as dusk was painting the sky in shades of orange and violet. His home was not what she expected. She had vaguely pictured a teepee or some crude hut. Instead, nestled in a small grove of cottonwood trees by a trickling creek, was a small, sturdy-looking structure. It was an adobe, a small house made of sun-dried earth and clay, with a flat roof and a single door. It was humble tiny compared to her father's mansion, but it was solid and clearly built with care. Smoke curled lazily from a chimney pipe. Nakai dismounted and began to unsaddle the horses without a word. He moved with an unhurried, efficient grace. Catherine, unsure of the protocol, slid stiffly from her mare. Every muscle in her body ached. He gestured with his chin towards the adobe. It was a clear, simple command. Go inside. She hesitated, then pushed open the heavy wooden door. The interior was a single room, larger than it appeared from the outside. It was spare, but immaculately clean. A fire burned in a small, well-made hearth, casting a warm glow on the smooth earthen walls. A simple wooden table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A bed, little more than a raised platform covered in furs and woven blankets, was tucked into one corner. Cooking pots and utensils hung neatly from pegs on the wall. It was the home of a man who lived a simple, solitary life. There was no room for her here, no space for her trunk, her books, her entire former existence. Nakai entered a few minutes later, carrying her trunk as if it weighed nothing. He set it down against the wall, and the piece of fine, polished luggage looked absurdly out of place. He then moved to the hearth, stirring a pot that hung over the fire. The smell of stew rabbit and wild herbs filled the small space. He ladled some into a wooden bowl and set it on the table along with a piece of flatbread. He then served himself and sat down. He did not invite her to eat. He simply began his meal, his gaze focused on his bowl. The message was clear. He had fulfilled his obligation by bringing her here. He had provided shelter and food. Nothing more was expected or offered. Catherine's stomach growled, but her pride warred with her hunger. She would not be treated like a stray dog to be fed. She sat on the edge of the cot, her back to him, and pretended to be engrossed in studying the patterns of the woven blanket. The silence in the small room was deafening, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the sound of Nakai eating. When he was finished, he cleaned his bowl and utensils with water from a bucket and set them aside to dry. He then took a blanket from the bed and laid it on the floor near the hearth. He lay down, pulling the blanket over him, and turned his back to the room. Within minutes, his breathing deepened into the steady rhythm of sleep. Catherine was left alone, wide awake in the darkness. The bed was hers, but the gesture felt less like chivalry and more like a statement of distance. He was sleeping on the floor, a stranger in his own home, to accommodate the unwanted woman who now inhabited it. Tears of frustration and despair finally came. She cried silently, muffling her sobs in the furs so he would not hear. This was her new life. A world of silence shared with a man who had won her like a trophy, and now seemed to have no idea what to do with her. The days that followed fell into a strange, silent routine. Nakai would rise before dawn and disappear for hours hunting or trapping. He would return with food, a brace of quail, a rabbit, or sometimes fish from the creek. He would prepare it, they would eat in silence, and he would sleep on the floor. Catherine tried to make herself useful. She swept the earthen floor, kept the fire going, and washed their few dishes. She learned by watching him, observing how he ground corn into meal, how he found the tender roots of certain plants. He never instructed her, but he never stopped her either. It was a silent apprenticeship. One afternoon, desperate for something to do, she unpacked her books. She sat at the table and began to read. Nakai returned and paused in the doorway, his eyes falling on the book in her hands. She couldn't read his expression. It wasn't disapproval exactly. It was more like curiosity, as if the book were an artifact from a different planet. He said nothing and went about his tasks, but she felt his awareness of her in a new way. The loneliness was a physical ache. She missed conversation, she missed music, she missed the simple act of being acknowledged. Her husband treated her like a piece of furniture, a silent breathing object that now shared his space. Her resentment festered. This was her prison. He was her jailer. One evening she couldn't stand it anymore. "Why did you do it?" She burst out, her voice raw from disuse. Nakai, who was sharpening a knife by the fire, went still. He did not turn to look at her. "Why did you tame the horse?" she pressed on, needing to shatter the oppressive silence. "Did you know about my foolish promise? Did you do it to win me, to humiliate my father?" He remained silent for a long moment. Then, without turning, he spoke. His voice was deeper than she remembered, a low rumble. The horse, he said, his English, slow and deliberate, as if he were translating each word from another language. He had a strong spirit. Like you. It is wrong to break a spirit. It should be understood. He said nothing more. He returned to sharpening his knife, the rhythmic shk, shk, shk of stone on steel filling the quiet room. Catherine stared at his back, stunned. It was the most he had ever said to her, and his words chipped away at the wall of resentment she had so carefully constructed. He hadn't been thinking of her or her father or the prize. He had seen a kindred spirit in the corral, a wild thing being brutalized, and he had intervened. Her marriage wasn't an act of ambition or revenge. It was for him simply a consequence of an act of compassion. The realization did not make her feel any less trapped, but it changed the nature of her prison. And her jailer. Nakai's explanation echoed in Catherine's mind for days. It is wrong to break a spirit. It should be understood. He had been talking about the horse, but she knew, with a certainty, that unsettled her that he had also been talking about her. He saw her. Not as a prize or a scandal or a burden, but as a spirit that refused to be broken. The understanding did not magically solve their problems. The silence still reigned, but its quality began to change. It was less oppressive, more contemplative. Catherine started to observe him more closely, not as her captor, but as a man. She noticed the way his hands, though calloused, were gentle when he tended to a small wound on the mare's leg. She saw the quiet reverence with which he watched the sunrise each morning. He lived in a state of constant silent conversation with the world around him, a language she was only just beginning to perceive. One afternoon, while she was fetching water from the creek, a rattlesnake coiled in her path, its tail a blur of angry warning. Catherine froze, her heart seizing in her chest. Before she could scream, an arrow hissed past her ear and pinned the snake's head to the ground. Nakai emerged from the trees, a bow in his hand. He moved forward, calmly dispatched the still writhing snake with his knife, and then looked at her. "Pay attention," he said. It wasn't a scolding, but a simple statement of fact. The land speaks. You must learn to listen. He showed her what to listen for, the specific cry of a jay that signaled a predator, the way the leaves of the cottonwoods turned just before a rain, the subtle tracks that told the story of which animals had passed by in the night. He taught her the names of the plants, which ones could be eaten, which could be used for medicine, and which were poison. He never gave long lectures. He would simply point. Ocotillo, he'd say, indicating the spiny plant. Tea from the flower is for coughs, or he would crumble a leaf from a creosote bush. Smell. This is the smell of rain coming. Catherine, the girl who had studied Latin and French literature, found herself a student in a new, more vital school. She was a clumsy pupil at first, but she was intelligent and a keen observer. She learned to move more quietly, to see instead of just look, to listen instead of just hear. Slowly the harsh alien landscape began to transform into a place of intricate beauty and meaning. Their first real conversation happened a month into their marriage. A late spring storm rolled in with unexpected fury. Wind howled around the small adobe, and rain lashed against the walls. A powerful gust tore a section of the roof open, and icy water began to pour into the room. Working together without needing to speak, they moved everything away from the deluge. Nakai grabbed tools and spare timbers and climbed onto the roof in the heart of the storm. Terrified he would be blown off, Catherine held a lantern for him from the doorway, its light flickering wildly in the wind. When he finally came back inside, soaked and shivering, the leak was stopped. She built up the fire and handed him a dry blanket. As he sat huddled by the hearth, shivering, she did something she hadn't done before. She made him a cup of the Ocotillo tea he had shown her. He took the warm mug, his fingers brushing hers. It was the first time they had touched. A jolt like lightning shot up her arm. "Thank you," he murmured, looking at her. For the first time his eyes weren't unreadable. They held a clear, unguarded warmth. "I was afraid you would fall," she confessed, her voice soft. "The roof is strong," he said. "I built it to last." "You built this house?" she asked, surprised. He nodded. "With my father. Before he died." It was a small piece of his history, a crack in the wall of his silence. She found herself wanting to know more. What was he like? He was a quiet man, a good hunter. "He taught me to listen." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping their tea and listening to the storm rage outside. The small adobe, which had once felt like a prison, now felt like a sanctuary, a warm, safe haven against the wildness of the world. "In my father's house," Catherine said, thinking aloud, "we had servants to fix a leaking roof. I never knew how." "It is better to know how," Nakai said simply. "Then you are not helpless." The words struck a deep chord within her. Her entire life she had been sheltered and cared for, but in a way she had been helpless, dependent on her father's wealth and position. Here in this wild place, she was learning to be self-reliant. She was learning to be strong in a way she had never known. A strange feeling began to blossom in her chest, a feeling she couldn't quite name. It wasn't love, not yet. But it was a deep and growing respect. It was a bond being forged, not by words or promises, but by shared experience and silent understanding. She was beginning to realize that Nakai had tamed more than just a horse that day in the corral. He was slowly, patiently taming the wildness in her own heart, not by breaking it, but by showing her how to understand it. Meanwhile, back in Prescott, the whispers against them were not fading. Thomas Sterling, his pride still festering, refused to let the scandal die. He had lost Catherine, and he had been made a fool of. He began to spend time in saloons, buying drinks for disgruntled ranchers and miners, poisoning their minds with stories. He spoke of dark Apache magic, of how Nakai must have bewitched both the horse and the girl, and with each telling the story grew darker, and the resentment in the hearts of his listeners grew deeper. He was planting the seeds of a storm far more dangerous than the one they had just weathered. The fragile peace of their world was shattered on a blistering afternoon in late summer. Catherine was tending to a small garden she had started behind the adobe, a patch of squash and beans that was her own small victory over the harsh land. She heard the sound first, the rhythmic beat of multiple horses approaching too fast to be friendly. She stood up, shading her eyes. A group of about a dozen riders was descending the low rise that overlooked their property. They were not soldiers or lawmen. They were townsmen ranchers, their faces grim under the brims of their dusty hats. And leading them on a fine bay gelding was Thomas Sterling. Nakai emerged from the adobe, a throwing axe in his hand, held loosely at his side. He had heard them too. He positioned himself in front of the door in front of her, a silent, unmovable guardian. The riders fanned out, forming a loose semicircle, trapping them against the small house. Sterling trotted his horse forward, a smug, cruel smile on his face. "Well, well, Catherine," he called out, his voice dripping with mock pity. "I see your savage has you farming like a common squaw. I've come to take you home." "This is my home," Catherine said, her voice steady, despite the frantic pounding of her heart. "And you are not welcome here, Thomas." His smile tightened. "You don't have a choice. We've come for him." He pointed a gloved finger at Nakai. "Jebediah Smith, you remember old Jebediah had 2 of his best cattle stolen last night. The tracks led straight out of town towards the reservation." "That has nothing to do with us," Catherine said flatly. "We haven't left this land in a week." "Oh, I think it does," Sterling sneered. "Everyone knows what happens when his kind gets a little taste of our world. They get greedy. A woman isn't enough. They want our cattle, our property." It was a lie, a thin, transparent pretext, and she knew it instantly. This wasn't about cattle. It was about pride, prejudice, and Sterling's wounded ego. He had roused a posse, fueled by whiskey and racism, to settle a personal score. One of the men, a rancher named Cole Barton, whose face was flushed with drink, spat on the ground. "We know your tricks, Apache. Bewitching horses, stealing women. Stealing cattle is easy after that." Nakai remained silent, his eyes scanning the men assessing the threat. He wasn't looking at their faces. He was looking at their hands, at the rifles resting in their saddle scabbards, at the way they held their reins. There were no tracks here. Nakai said, his voice calm and even. It carried a weight that made a few of the men shift uncomfortably. "The ground is hard. A dozen men on horseback leave a clear trail. You did not. You came from the south road from town." Sterling's face flushed with anger at being so easily read. "Are you calling me a liar, savage? I am stating a fact," Nakai replied. This calm defiance enraged Sterling further. "That's enough. We're taking you in. You'll get a trial of a sort." The men behind him chuckled darkly. They all knew what kind of trial an Apache accused of rustling would get at the end of a rope. 2 of the men began to dismount, reaching for their ropes. This was it. The moment of decision. The world she had come from was here offering her a violent, ugly rescue. They saw her as a victim, a captive to be saved. They saw her husband as a thief, a lesser being to be disposed of. But Catherine no longer saw a savage. She saw the man who had shown her how to listen to the land. She saw the man who slept on the floor so she could have a bed. She saw the man who had faced a storm to fix their roof, who had saved her from a snake, who had respected her spirit when no one else had. In a flash, she knew what she had to do. She moved. Before anyone could react, she darted into the adobe. The men outside tensed, thinking she was running to hide. She emerged a second later, not with a white flag of surrender, but with the pearl-handled derringer in her hand. It was a small gun, a lady's weapon, but its twin barrels looked deadly serious in the stark sunlight. She didn't point it at Sterling. She walked straight to Diablo, who was tethered nearby, and placed the muzzle against his sleek black neck. The horse stood perfectly still, trusting the woman who now brought him water and sweet grass each day. "The first man who takes another step towards my husband," Catherine said, her voice ringing with cold, absolute fury, "will force me to shoot this horse." The very horse this whole ridiculous affair started over. The men stopped dead in their tracks. Sterling stared at her, his jaw slack with astonishment. "Are you insane, Catherine?" he gasped. "That's $1,000 animal. He's my husband's horse," she retorted, her eyes blazing. "And this is my husband's land. You are trespassing, and you are making false accusations. You want a thief? Then go find one. But you will not take an innocent man from his home. Not today." Her defense of Nakai, her willingness to destroy the valuable animal, was so unexpected, so contrary to how a rescued woman should behave, that it threw the entire posse into confusion. They had come, expecting a grateful, tearful victim, not a defiant protector. Nakai watched her, and for the briefest moment, a look of profound astonishment crossed his face, quickly replaced by a fierce, burning pride. "She's bewitched," Barton muttered, unnerved. "Look at her. It's like she's not herself." "I have never been more myself in my entire life," Catherine shot back. "Now get off my land." Sterling, seeing he was losing control of his men, and the situation grew desperate. "Don't listen to her. She's been out here too long, her mind's gone." "Rush them!" But his command was hesitant, and the men did not move. They were ranchers, not murderers, and the sight of the judge's daughter holding a gun to her own prized horse, defending an Apache, had shaken them. The situation had spiraled beyond a simple drunken lynching party. It was then that a new rider appeared on the rise, a single man on a fine grey horse, riding hard. It was Judge Lawrence Hayes. Judge Hayes reined his horse to a skidding halt, his eyes taking in the scene with a lawyer's swift assessing glance, the armed posse, his daughter holding a derringer to the famous black stallion, and the Apache standing like a rock at her side. A flicker of something unreadable, was it? Fear, was it pride, crossed his face as he looked at Catherine. "Sterling, what is the meaning of this?" the judge demanded, his voice booming with the authority of the courtroom. Thomas Sterling, momentarily flustered by the judge's arrival, quickly regained his composure. "Judge Hayes, thank goodness. We've come to rescue Catherine. This savage stole cattle from Jebediah Smith. We were taking him in for justice." The judge's sharp eyes narrowed. "Did you witness him stealing these cattle, Mr. Sterling?" "Well, no, but the tracks." "Jebediah Smith reported his cattle stolen less than 3 hours ago." The judge cut in his tone, icy. "I was with him when he did. It would have been impossible for you to gather a posse and track him here in that time, especially since, as I understand it, you have been in town all day stirring up trouble at the saloon." The color drained from Sterling's face. He had been caught in his lie by the one man whose approval he craved most. Judge Hayes turned his attention to the other men. "And as for the rest of you, Cole Barton, Samuel Pike, you are cattlemen. You know as well as I do that a rustler's tracks don't simply vanish. If you had any real evidence, you would have brought it to the sheriff, not formed a lynch mob." The men shifted their bravado, evaporating under the judge's legalistic glare. They looked at their boots, at their saddles, anywhere but at him. They had been played for fools by Sterling, their own prejudices used against them. "This man," the judge said, gesturing towards Nakai, "is by law Catherine's husband. This land is legally his. You are an armed mob trespassing on private property and making threats. Disband and go home before I have Sheriff Miller arrest every last one of you." Grumbling ashamed, the men began to turn their horses around. There was no arguing with the judge when he used that tone. Sterling, however, was consumed by a desperate, sputtering rage. "You would choose him over me," he screamed at Catherine, his handsome face twisted into an ugly mask. "An animal? After everything my family can offer you, he is twice the man you will ever be." Thomas Catherine said quietly, lowering the derringer but not her gaze. "Now leave." Defeated and humiliated, Sterling wrenched his horse's reins and galloped away, his posse trailing sheepishly behind him. An awkward silence settled over the homestead, broken only by the chirping of crickets. Judge Hayes dismounted, his movements stiff. He looked from his daughter's determined face to Nakai's impassive one. He looked at the small, tidy adobe, the budding garden, the clear creek. He saw not a prison, but a home. "The pouch I gave you," he said to Catherine, his voice rough with emotion. "I had hoped you would use it to buy passage away from here, away from him." "I am not leaving," Catherine stated simply. There was no defiance in her tone, only certainty. The judge nodded slowly, a long, weary sigh escaping him. "I received a letter this morning from your aunt in San Francisco. She heard of the marriage. She offered to have you, to give you a new life when no one knows your story." He held out the letter. Catherine looked at the envelope, at the elegant script that promised a return to her old world, a world of comfort, society, and conversation, a world without silence. Then she looked at Nakai, who was watching her, his dark eyes holding a question he would never speak aloud. He was giving her a choice. His stillness was a form of freedom. She shook her head and pushed the letter back towards her father. "Tell Aunt Josephine that I am grateful," she said. "But my story is here now. I am not ashamed of it." For the first time, a genuine, unguarded emotion broke through her father's stern facade. He looked at the strong, self-possessed woman his daughter had become, standing shoulder to shoulder with a man he had called a savage, and he saw that she was not broken or bewitched. She was whole. He looked at Nakai. "You have taught her something I could not," he said, the admission costing him a great deal of pride. To be strong on her own terms. Nakai simply inclined his head in acknowledgement. The judge lingered for a moment more, as if there were 1,000 things left to say, and no words to say them. Finally he turned, mounted his horse, and rode away, not looking back. He was leaving her in a world he did not understand, but he finally seemed to understand that it was where she belonged. As the dust from her father's horse settled, Catherine and Nakai stood together in the quiet of the evening. The immediate danger was gone, but the confrontation had changed everything. The unspoken things that had hung between them for months had been burned away in the heat of the standoff. Catherine turned to him. "I was afraid," she admitted. "You are not," Nakai corrected her gently. "Fear is a stone that sinks. You are a hawk that flies into the wind. I saw you. I saw you." The simple words filled her with a warmth that spread through her entire being. He had always seen her. He had seen her spirit from the very beginning. She looked up at him, at the quiet strength in his face, the deep wisdom in his eyes. He was no longer a stranger, no longer her jailer. He was her partner, her protector, her husband. Slowly she reached out and took his hand. His calloused fingers closed around hers, a firm, warm anchor in the vast, wild landscape. It was a simple gesture, but it was a promise, a vow renewed not by force or by a foolish joke, but by choice. Their life would not be easy. The world beyond their small piece of land would likely never understand them. But standing there hand in hand as the sun set behind the mountains, they faced their future not in silence and fear, but with a quiet, shared language of the heart. They had found each other in the most unlikely of ways, two strong spirits who had refused to be broken and who had finally truly been understood. And so Catherine's careless joke became the beginning of her true life. Her story isn't just about a romance. It's about looking past the surface, beyond the prejudices of society, to find a truth worth fighting for. It reminds us that sometimes the greatest strength isn't found in loud declarations, but in a quiet, steady presence. Catherine and Nakai built a life not on shared words, but on a shared understanding of the heart and the spirit. If you were moved by Catherine and Nakai's journey from strangers to soulmates, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share this video with a friend who appreciates a story of courage and unconventional love. And most importantly, if you want more tales that sweep you away to another time and place, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next story.